So we are on chapter 2 today, and this is how Africa developed before the coming of the Europeans up to the 15th century. Before even the British came into relations with our people, we were a developed people, having our own institutions, having our own ideas of government. That's a quote from J.E. Casely Hayford, African Gold Coast nationalist, 1922. Baba Rodney starts a general overview. It has been shown that using comparative standards, Africa today is underdeveloped in relation to Western Europe and a few other parts of the world, and that the present position has been arrived at not by the separate evolution of Africa on the one hand and Europe on the other, but through exploitation. He's very clear to make that point. The only reason you're looking at Africa as underdeveloped is because you're measuring it by Western European standards, right? And he's saying that the only reason Africa is underdeveloped is because of exploitation by that very entity that you're using to measure it by. As is well known, Africa has had prolonged and extensive contact with Europe. And one has to bear in mind that contact between different societies changes their respective rates of development. To set the record straight, 4 operations are required. 1. Reconstruction of the nature of development in Africa before the coming of Europeans. 2. Reconstruction of the nature of development which took place in Europe before expansion abroad. 3. Analysis of Africa's contribution to Europe's present developed state. And 4. Analysis of Europe's contribution to Africa's present underdeveloped state. Now, in all my being in spaces with Africans who are trying to find solutions for the problem, the current state of Africa, and in all my debating and arguing and sharing observations, I haven't heard it explained as simply as that. And I would urge those of us who are getting in rooms to discuss what the problems are and what the solutions are to make it that simple. Baba Rodney says, to set the record straight, 4 operations are required. In other words, if you're going to be sitting in a room to find solutions for Africa, this is a place to start, right? First, reconstruct the nature of development in Africa before the coming of Europeans. In other words, go back and see what the nature of development in Africa was before the coming of Europeans. We are reconstructing it because we have been miseducated, which is why we are reconstructing. So the education, the miseducation that has been put in our minds, we're going to erase it and put back what actually happened, what the nature of development in Africa before the coming of Europeans was. How were Africans developing before the invasion of Europeans in Africa? 2, reconstruction of the nature of development which took place in Europe before expansion abroad, right? Look at how Europe was developing or not developing before they expanded abroad. 3, analysis of Africa's contribution. And I'll say on that number 2, we all, those of us who are, let me not say we all, because not all of us do. At one point, I didn't have that information. Europe, after World War II, and that by then they're already in Africa, but think about World War II, their economies are falling apart, right? And that's when they intensify the structures, the monetary structures, the UN and all that is going to now like just ground itself in the exploitation of Africa. They're doing that because they are not developing, because they're risking falling apart. And so they have found out that there's a place where there are resources, and that's where they go in. So if we're going to go back to that, which is reconstruct, you will see that at one point, Europe was very desperate and not developed, and they reach out to Africa to help that. This is what Baba Rodney is telling us. To do that helps you understand how they are the ones who have underdeveloped Africa. 3, analysis of Africa's contribution to Europe's present developed state. That exactly is what we're saying. How did Europe develop before expanding abroad? How is Europe now developed after expanding abroad? Then analysis of Europe's contribution to Africa's present underdeveloped state. Through that developing after expanding abroad, that is the result of expanding abroad. How did that expansion of Europe underdevelop Africa? The second task has already been extensively carried out in European literature, and only passing references need to be made, but the others are all deserving of further attention. The African continent reveals very fully the workings of the law of uneven development of societies. There are marked contrasts between the Ethiopian Empire and the hunting groups of pygmies in the Congo forest, or between the empires of the Western Sudan and the Khoisan hunter-gatherers of the Kalahari Desert. Indeed, there were striking contrasts within any given geographical area. The Ethiopian Empire embraced literate feudal Amharic noblemen as well as simple Kaffa cultivators and Gala pastoralists. The empires of the Western Sudan had sophisticated, educated Mandinga townsmen, small communities of Bozo fishermen, and nomadic Fulani herdsmen. Even among clans and lineages that appear roughly similar, there were considerable differences. However, it is possible to distinguish between what was uniquely African and what was universal in the sense of being characteristic of all human societies at a given stage of development. It is also essential to recognize the process of dialectical evolution from lower to higher forms of social organization. And in looking at the most advanced social formations, one would appreciate the potential of the continent as a whole and the direction of change. I'll repeat that one more time. It is also essential to recognize the process of dialectical evolution from lower to higher forms of social organization. And in looking at the most advanced social formations, one would appreciate the potential of the continent as a whole and the direction of change. The moment that the topic of the pro-European African past is raised, many individuals are concerned for various reasons to know about the existence of African civilizations. Mainly, this stems from a desire to make comparisons with European civilizations. This is not the context in which to evaluate the so-called civilizations of Europe. It is enough to note the behavior of European capitalists from the epoch of slavery through colonialism, fascism, and genocidal wars in Asia and Africa. Such barbarism causes suspicion to attach to the use of the word civilization to describe Western Europe and North America. As far as Africa is concerned, during the period of early development, it is preferable to speak in terms of cultures rather than civilizations. A culture is a total way of life. It embraces what people ate and what they wore, the way they walked, and the way they talked, the manner in which they treated death and greeted the newborn. Obviously, unique features came into existence in virtually every locality with regard to all social details. In addition, the continent of Africa south of the Great Sahara Desert formed a broad community where resemblances were clearly discernible. For example, music and dance had key roles in uncontaminated African society. He's calling it uncontaminated. They were ever present at birth, initiation, marriage, death, as well as at times of recreation. I remember, I'll pause there quickly, at one of my families here in the States, one of my family's funerals, we were singing, the Kenyan side of the family was singing, those who grew up in Kenya. And the American side of the family was wondering why we were singing at a funeral, right? Because to them, that culture is just, it's foreign to them. But to us, it was just normal to be singing at a funeral. African peoples reached the pinnacle of achievement in that sphere. Because of the impact of colonialism and cultural imperialism, which will be discussed later, Europeans and Africans themselves in the colonial period lacked due regard for the unique features of African culture. Exactly what I was just saying, right? They look at it as inferior because they don't appreciate it. Those features have a value of their own that cannot be eclipsed by European culture, either in the comparable period before 1500 or in the subsequent centuries. They cannot be eclipsed because they are not really comparable phenomena. Who in this world is competent to judge whether an Austrian waltz is better than a Makonde Ngoma? I will ask that again because I want all the white people who will ever listen to this and who are not in solidarity with us to hear that question. Because we're asking you, how dare you think you can tell us how our culture should be? How dare you? Who in this world is competent to judge whether an Austrian waltz is better than a Makonde Ngoma? Like, nani alikuambia utatuambia ambavyo tunaendeleza utamaduni wetu? That's the question. Who gave you the right to judge how we Africans carry out our culture? Furthermore, even in those spheres of culture that are more readily comparable, such as the fine arts, it is known that African achievements of the pre-European period stand as contribution to man's heritage of beautiful creations. The art of Egypt, the Sudan, and Ethiopia was known to the rest of the world at an early date. That of the rest of Africa is still being discovered and rediscovered by Europeans and present-day Africans. The verdict of art historians on the Ife and Benin bronzes is well known. Since they date from the 14th and 15th centuries, they are very relevant to any discussion of African development in the epoch before the contacts with Europe. Nor should they be regarded as unusual, except with regard to the material in which the sculptures were executed. The same skill and feeling obviously went into sculpture and artwork in non-durable materials, especially wood. Baba Rodney talks about culture in The Groundings with My Brothers. He has a whole chapter on it. And as far as the Benin sculptures, the bronzes and all that, he talks about the European invaders at one point who were so in disbelief that Africans could create such art that they were insisting that there must have been some white people who were here, the Greeks or the Romans. Maybe they influenced this. It cannot be. And it got to a point where they could not deny that these were Africans who were creating it, because clearly there were Africans over there and they could see with their left and their right eye an African creating it, right? Anyway, I digress. African dance and art were almost invariably linked with a religious world outlook in one way or another. As is well known, traditional African religious practices exist in great variety. And it should also be remembered that both Islam and Christianity found homes on the African continent almost from the very inception. The features of the traditional African religions help to set African cultures apart from those in other continents. But in this present context, it is more important to note how much African religion had in common with religion elsewhere, and how this can be used as an index to the level of development in Africa before European impact in the 15th century. I'm going to pause there because my garbage truck is here, and last time it was interfering. So I'll pause there and we'll have some music and we'll come right back. Yes. We're back, and there's no noise. At least no garbage truck noise. So let's get back to it. Religion is an aspect of the superstructure of a society, deriving ultimately from the degree of control and understanding of the material world. However, when man thinks in religious terms, he starts from the ideal rather than with the material world, which is beyond his comprehension. Yo, let that sit with you. When man thinks in religious terms, he starts from the ideal rather than with the material world, which is beyond his comprehension. This creates a non scientific and metaphysical way of viewing the world, which often conflicts with the scientific materialistic outlook and with the development of society. African ancestral religions were no better or worse than other religions as such. But by the end of feudalism, Europeans began to narrow the area of human life in which religion and the church played a part. Religion, yeah, I won't interrupt. I think Baba Rodney will explain. Religion ceased to dominate politics, geography, medicine. To free those things from religious restraints, it had to be argued that religion had its own sphere and the things of this world had their own secular sphere. That's what Western culture does to African culture. This secularization of life speeded up the development of capitalism and later socialism. In contrast, in the period before the coming of the whites, religion pervaded African life just as it pervaded life in other pre feudal societies, such as those of the Maoris of Australia and the Afghans of Afghanistan or the Vikings of Scandinavia. Religion can play both a positive and a negative role as an aspect of the superstructure. In most instances, in early Africa, religious beliefs were associated with the mobilization and discipline of large numbers of people to form states. In a few instances, religion also provided concepts in the struggle for social justice. The negative aspects usually arose out of the tendency of religion to persist unchanged for extremely long periods, especially when the technology of earning a living changes very slowly. This was the case in African societies, as in all other pre capitalist societies. At the same time, the religious beliefs themselves react upon the mode of production, further slowing up progress in that respect. For instance, belief in prayer and in the intervention of ancestors and various gods could easily be a substitute for innovations designed to control the impact of weather and environment. The same kind of two sided relationship also exists between the means of earning a living and the social patterns that arise in the process of work. In Africa, before the 15th century, the predominant principle of social relations was that of family and kinship associated with communalism. Every member of an African society had his position defined in terms of relatives on his mother's side and on his father's side. Some societies placed greater importance on matrilineal ties and others on patrilineal ties. Those things were crucial to the daily existence of a member of an African society because land, the major means of production, was owned by groups such as the family or clan, the head of which were parents and those yet unborn. Back at home in Kenya, the land where we settle right now, I cannot say is my land. My brother cannot say it's his land. That is our family's land, literally. It's the land that my grandpa got for the family. So it belongs to the family. And it's a large family for that. In theory, this pattern was explained by saying that the residents in any community were all direct descendants of the first person who settled the land, like I just said. When a new group arrived, they often made a pretense that they too had ancestry dating back to the settling of the land, or else they ensured that members of the earliest kin groups continued to perform the ceremonies related to the land and water of the region. Similarly, the labor that worked the land was generally recruited on a family basis. A single family or household would till its own plots and it would also be available to share certain joint farming activities with other members of the extended family or clan. Annual hunts and river fishing were also organized by a whole extended family or village community. And this, in more recent times, is seen mostly in the Maasai community. I've seen now they're moving away from their culture, unfortunately, because the Western culture has started to penetrate their culture. But in more recent times, the Maasai held on to this aspect of their culture. In a matrilineal society, such as that of the Bemba in Zambia, the bridegroom spent a number of years working for the father of his bride. And many young men who had married daughters of the same household often formed work teams to help each other. In Dahomey, a young man did not go to live with his wife's family, but the Dokpwe, or work team, allowed a son to participate in carrying out a task of some magnitude for the father of his wife. In both of those examples, the right of the father-in-law to acquire labor and the obligations of the son-in-law to give labor were based on kinship. This can be contrasted with capitalism, where money buys labor, and with feudalism, where the serf provides labor in order to have access to a portion of land which belongs to the landlord. Having been produced on land that was family property and through family labor, the resultant crops and other goods were distributed on the basis of kinship ties. If a man's crops were destroyed by some sudden calamity, relatives in his own village helped him. If the whole community was in distress, people moved to live with their kinsmen in another area where food was not scarce. I'm telling you, we had it right. We need to go back. In Akan country, Ghana, the clan system was highly organized, so that a man from Brong could visit Fante many hundreds of miles away and receive food and hospitality from a complete stranger who happened to be of his own clan. And for me growing up, I didn't experience much of this like very communal African culture, but I did experience, because my when I was born, the invaders had already come and the influence had already started penetrating our cultures. But we still had that communal spirit where back in the day, my grandma would send us to the neighbor to get something, right? Back in the day, my grandma would pack a bag of corn or something, send it to so and so. Back in the day, my grandma would tell us, take this milk to so and so, you know? That doesn't happen anymore.